the Jewish bankers were financing the Spanish Revolution. During these revolutions, the Catholic Church was always on the receiving end. And then we see the priests, the Catholic priests, fighting revolutionaries in the Spanish Revolution.
It began as any good dream should, with bursts of joy and optimism. When King Alfonso XIII decided to allow elections, socialist and liberal republicans, anarchists and communists swept to overwhelming victories, and the Second Spanish Republic was born. But the flame of hope flickered out in just 2 years amid the poverty and unemployment of the Great Depression. Conservatives won the next election and rolled back many of the changes. The left, incensed, countered with a general strike, but it was shut down by the army. In 1936, power swung back to the left, when the Popular Front, a broad coalition of liberal and socialist groups, eked out a parliamentary majority. The political divide quickly became a chasm. The right, consisting of the military, conservatives, and the Catholic Church, feared for the very survival of Spain. President Manuel Azaña further inflamed the situation as he began reinstituting changes from 1931 that hindered large farms and the church. At the same time, anarchists began pushing Bolshevism, and some conservatives joined the fascist Falange Española. Multiple militias formed on both sides. It was a battleground for idealists. Violence escalated, culminating in a series of assassinations that finally killed democracy. The Civil War exploded with a coup led by General Franco and the army.
Fighting in Spanish Morocco in the early part of the century, Franco had made a name for himself as an energetic and courageous officer. And he was soon given command of the Spanish Foreign Legion, going on to become, at 33, Spain's youngest general. In 1931, to avoid civil war, King Alfonso went into exile. Each side became determined not merely to defeat the other, but to exterminate it. Churches were burned, priests murdered, workers, liberals, leftists were shot down.
The social upheavals of the Republic had led to a progressive breakdown of law and order. In the countryside, peasants hungry to own the land they worked seized it. Some landowners had been killed, and others feared for their lives.
Peace was impossible, so we had to head for the hills. If it's just not possible to live, then you have to find a different solution, which was the rising against the Republic.
In 1936, Hitler had been in power for 3 years. Mussolini had ruled Italy since 1922. In Russia, Stalin had begun the show trials and purges of his enemies. Immediately, both sides sought and found gestures of support from rival sponsors abroad. In the liberal democratic world, individual sympathy for the plight of the Spanish Republic was widespread, but practical help from governments was to prove a different matter. The army rebels' pleas, on the other hand, were soon answered. Two days after the Spanish uprising, Franco had appealed to the Führer for help. Hitler decided to send not the few anti-aircraft guns and fighters that Franco had asked for, but a full squadron of Junkers transport planes to airlift the Spanish Army of Africa from Morocco. 1,500 of these troops were transported to Seville to begin their fighting passage to Madrid. These crack troops of the Spanish army were to play a decisive role in the war. His help was later rewarded with a constant supply of Spanish iron ore.
The nationalists grew stronger. Mussolini added 100,000 men and more firepower. The undermanned Republic, without most of the army, had to arm its citizens and turn to the communists of the Soviet Union for help. Support also came from Mexico and from an unexpected source. More than 40,000 volunteers from 53 nations joined the Republicans, including a group from distant America known as the Lincoln Battalion.
"70 years ago, 500 young Scots risked their lives by volunteering to fight in another country's war. This group of men threw themselves headfirst into the bloody struggle against fascism. A third never returned. They were the Scots who fought Franco. The Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939 was a conflict that gripped Scotland. It was the defining moment for a generation of Scots and, for a time, the country's greatest cause. Proportionately, Scots made a greater contribution than any other nationality. 549 of those volunteers came from Scotland. It was also illegal. At the start of the war, the British government signed up to a non-intervention agreement, outlawing participation in Spain's war and banning the sale of arms to the country. The Scotland those men left behind was far removed from the Scotland of today. It was a time of regular strike action, incendiary street preachers, and a belief in great causes. Scotland stood out in Europe as both one of its poorest countries and one of its most radical. In February 1937, the newly formed British Battalion of the International Brigades had arrived at Jarama and been given the task of stemming a fascist advance on the Spanish capital. Over 100 Scots were involved in wading through the winter mud to wage war. The Battle of Jarama was an almighty slog that set the fault lines for this most bloody of conflicts. The ill-prepared and under-equipped British battalion was left dangerously exposed at Jarama. In the first week of fighting, their entire machine gun company was ambushed and captured by General Franco's Army of Africa, the Moors. Emboldened by the outcome of the battle, the British battalion's leaders planned an offensive at Brunetti, to the west of Madrid. In the baking July heat, optimism soon turned to terror. The British were slaughtered. Of 331 men present on the first day of battle, 289 were killed, wounded or captured. Scots suffered more than most. By the summer of 1937, the Scots who fought Franco were demoralized and had witnessed slaughter on an unimaginable scale. The great cause they had pledged themselves to was ridden with bleak reality. In Spain, their idealism had been severely tested. They had found hell. At the end of August 1938, the Scots who fought Franco were holding firm in Catalonian mountains. They remained deeply committed to the cause, despite monstrous conditions and heavy losses. Yet their fate was set not in battle, but in the corridors of power. In late September, the Republican government announced the withdrawal of the International Brigades. They believed that the move would force Hitler and Mussolini to remove their troops from Spain. It was a forlorn hope. Surviving Scots marched through the streets of Barcelona as part of an emotional farewell parade. The great Republican leader, La Pasionaria, paid tribute to their efforts, telling them, "You can go with pride."
It was an endless, grinding war until Franco tried a new tactic. Living under the constant threat of bombing took its toll, slowly draining away the will of the people and the Republic. In January 1939, Barcelona fell, and Madrid soon followed in March, bringing to a close the Spanish Civil War.
Valle de los Caídos, in Spain, the Valley of the Fallen. Nearly half a century after the Civil War, the men who created and won that war have preserved its massive monument. General Franco called the uprising against the Republican government a crusade, a fight for Christian civilization. It was for nearly 3 years the world's moral arena. Inside this mausoleum today, there is no hint of reconciliation. This huge tomb for Franco's men was hewn in a granite mountain by his defeated enemies, Republican prisoners of war. Behind the altar, the Generalissimo himself, Franco. As a soldier, Franco had served the Republic. He was called a fascist and died a dictator.